Just after 6:45 a.m. on October 25th, 1944, the night squalls off Samar began to thin. And the men of Task Unit 77.4.3 finally saw what their radar had been trying to warn them about. On the western horizon, through rain and gunmetal haze, grey shapes resolved into towers of superstructure and triple turrets. Within minutes, the reports solidified into a number that made no sense for a handful of escort carriers and tin can escorts. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, 23 Japanese warships in all, bearing down on 6 slow CVEs and 3 thin-skinned destroyers that had never been meant to stand in front of a fleet. On the bridge of USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans listened as his Combat Information Center read off the contacts and ranges. Somewhere out in that grey wall was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, with 18.1-inch guns that could lob a 1.5-ton shell over 20 miles. Her big gun salvo weighed more than Johnston's entire broadside. The destroyer under Evans' boots carried 5 5-inch guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and just enough armor to keep out splinters and bad weather. Against 23 ships like that, the arithmetic should have been hopeless. 1 tin can charging a line like that belonged in a war story, not in the morning plot of a real task unit. But the plot on the chart table was real enough. Taffy 3's 6 escort carriers were already turning away, their thin decks and slow screws dragging them across the sea at little more than escort speed. If they ran in a straight line, the center force would overtake them and crush them under long-range gunfire. If they sat still and tried to hide in rain and smoke, the Japanese could bracket them and walk salvos across the formation until there was nothing left but slicks of burning fuel and lifeboats. The problem was simple. The math was brutal. Evans had seen that kind of math in war games and staff papers for years. Destroyers were supposed to screen carriers, chase submarines, and, if necessary, launch torpedo attacks in concert with cruisers and battleships never alone. No Doctrine chart showed one Fletcher-class destroyer charging ahead of its own formation straight at 4 battleships and a pack of cruisers. But as the range numbers from the western horizon dropped and the first towering plumes of Japanese ranging shots erupted out of the sea, Doctrine seemed farther away than the battleships themselves. Survivors later recalled that Evans didn't hesitate long. He looked out over the escort carriers behind him, small, slow, stuffed with aircraft that were just beginning to warm up on the decks. Then he looked back toward the gun flashes starting to flicker on the horizon. There was nowhere else for help to come from. Whatever bought those carriers 10 more minutes to launch planes and thicken the sky had to come from the thin grey hull under his feet. He stepped back into the pilot house and gave the order that would define his ship and his name for the rest of the war. While most of the task unit was still processing what 23 enemy warships meant, Evans ordered Johnston to lay smoke for the carriers and then turn into the attack. Engines at flank speed, bow knifing straight toward Yamato's line as if she were the lead element of an entire carrier task force instead of 1 tin can and 200-odd men. If a single destroyer charging 23 warships is the kind of World War II story you don't want to lose to time. Tap like and consider subscribing so these records keep reaching people who still care. You can't really understand why Evans gave that order until you know who he was. And what kind of tin can he had spent months turning into a fighting ship? Ernest E. Evans did not look like the kind of officer who backed away from trouble. Born in Oklahoma, part Native American and raised far from any ocean, he fought his way into the U.S. Naval Academy and then through a string of peacetime and early war assignments where one pattern kept repeating when there was a hard job to be done. Evans moved toward it. Shipmates remembered a quiet man with a flat voice, a bad temper for anything he considered cowardice, and a very simple idea of what a warship existed to do. When he took command of USS Johnston in 1943, he made that idea explicit. On the day the destroyer was commissioned, he told his new crew plainly that this was going to be a fighting ship, and that he fully intended to take her into harm's way. It was not a speech about survival. It was a promise about how he would use the thin grey hull tied up to the pier. Over the next year, drills on Johnston were not designed to make life easy. Gunnery crews practiced until their shoulders ached. Torpedo teams rehearsed snap attacks in bad weather. Damage control parties crawled through dark compartments, learning how long they could function in heat and smoke. By October 1944, the men of Johnston might not have known where they would be sent, but they had no illusions about how their captain meant to fight once they got there. Leyte Gulf was supposed to be the moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy finally broke its teeth on American firepower. General Douglas MacArthur had come back to the Philippines with hundreds of transports, thousands of troops, and a covering armada so large that some sailors joked there was more steel off Leyte than water. To most of the men on Taffy 3, the big questions about battleships and carrier duels felt like they were being answered somewhere else, by people with bigger decks and heavier guns. On paper, Task Unit 77.4.3 was not a strike force. It was an air support and escort group. 6 small escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, Gambia Bay. 3 destroyers, Johnston, Howell, Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts. The carriers were converted merchant hulls with short decks and thin skins, designed to lug aircraft at convoy speed and put bombs and rockets on targets ashore, not to trade salvos with battleships. The destroyers and DEs were there to screen them from submarines and the occasional air attack. The American battle line, the cruisers and fast carriers that were built to meet a fleet head-on, were somewhere else. Admiral Halsey's fast carriers had charged north after a Japanese decoy carrier force. The old battleships that had crushed the southern Japanese column in Surigao Strait were too far away and pointed the wrong direction. Everyone assumed that the main Japanese center force, which had been savaged the day before in the Sibuyan Sea, was either sunk, retreating, or at least too damaged to be a factor. That assumption was wrong. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had taken hits cruisers sunk, ships damaged, but the core of his line was intact. He still had 4 battleships, including Yamato, along with a screen of heavy and light cruisers and destroyers. In the dark, through narrow waters and thinly watched straits, that force slipped back toward the east, passed through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait, and came out into the Philippine Sea with one clear objective: drive down on the American invasion area and smash any thin-skinned shipping he could find. Taffy there happened to be standing in the way, measured in tonnage, guns, and armor. The comparison was ugly. A Fletcher-class destroyer displaced a little over 2,000 tons. Yamato displaced more than 60,000. A 5-inch gun could throw a 55-pound shell about 9 miles. Yamato's main battery could throw shells 30 times heavier, more than twice that distance. Escort carriers could make maybe 17 knots on a good day, into a calm sea. Japanese cruisers and destroyers could run them down at 30 knots or better. The 6 CVEs of Taffy 3 were not empty. Their decks held FM-2 Wildcats and TBM Avengers, aircraft that had spent the last days pounding Japanese troops, ships, and airfields in support of the landings. But early on the morning of October 25th, many of those planes were sitting on deck, not gassed, not armed for anti-ship work. Others were already airborne with loads chosen for ground support or anti-submarine patrols, not for attacking battleships' depth charges, small bombs, and machine guns instead of armor-piercing ordnance in the first minutes after contact. The obvious play for a small escort group was clear run east. Lay smoke, call for help, launch whatever airplanes could fly, and hope that someone bigger and heavier arrived before the Japanese line caught up. Doctrine said destroyers should stay close enough to their carriers to screen them, close enough to throw up smoke and flak and, if the enemy got too near, maybe launch a coordinated torpedo attack under cover of bigger ships' guns. Doctrine did not envision one escort group alone on the receiving end of a full fleet sortie. Geography made the problem worse. Behind Taffy 3 lay the rest of the Leyte operation, more escort groups, more transports, the flow of reinforcements and supplies that would make MacArthur's I Shall Return more than a photograph on a beach. If Kurita punched through the screen in front of him, his battleships and cruisers could drive south and east, sinking slow, packed transports and fire support ships at will. Every minute that Taffy 3 delayed him was a minute more for invasion shipping to disperse or move. But every minute they stayed in front of him was another minute inside the envelope of heavy gunfire for the men on Johnston's bridge. The choices did not look like choices at all. They could run and almost certainly be overtaken. They could sit and be pounded apart from beyond the range of their own guns. They could hide in squalls and hope, for a little while, that the next ranging salvo walked over someone else instead. Somewhere between those bad options sat one that did not appear in any manual close the range as fast as possible, hit the enemy where his guns and armor were least efficient, and make so much violent, confusing resistance that the man on the other fleet's bridge started to doubt his own information. That idea did not come out of a staff exercise. It came from the way one destroyer captain thought about his ship, his crew, and his job. By the time Kurita's first salvos were straddling the escort carriers, Ernest Evans had already started to turn that idea into orders. On Johnston's bridge, the early reports from lookouts and CIC came in clipped, almost calm, enemy battleships bearing down, shell splashes already walking closer, escort carriers beginning to turn away, trying to buy distance one slow knot at a time. There was no order from higher command yet that could magically change what ships were on the plot. What Evans did next would come from his own reading of the situation, not from any printed plan. Survivors later remembered that he didn't ask for a conference or a vote. He simply began issuing orders. First came the obvious one, lay smoke. Johnston swung across the rear of the escort carriers. Smoke generators turned up, stack gases thickening into a grey-white curtain that began to hide the fat. Slow silhouettes of the CVEs from Japanese rangefinders. That alone would have been aggressive work for one destroyer under fire. But Evans was not thinking in terms of a screen that bought a few minutes. He was thinking of how to attack. While Johnston was still running her smoke line, he gave the second order that broke with Doctrine, instead of taking station in a defensive arc around the carriers. Evans ordered a turn toward the enemy. Left full rudder, engines to flank. The destroyer's bow came around, cutting through its own smoke, leaving the carriers in a shrouded bubble behind her. Men on deck felt the ship heel and soar. Through gaps in the haze, the distant flashes of enemy main batteries, down in the torpedo spaces. The crews did not need a long explanation. Fletcher-class destroyers carried 10 21-inch torpedoes in 2 quintuple mounts. Used properly, at the right range and angle. Those torpedoes were one of the few weapons on Johnston that could hurt a battleship badly with a single hit. But getting close enough to launch meant running straight into the envelope, where every Japanese gun from cruiser down to destroyer could reach them, while officers in CIC worked up an intercept course. Speed, target angles torpedomen checked gyro settings, warheads, and firing circuits. They knew the numbers their fish were most effective inside a few thousand yards. That meant letting the range close until the water between Johnston and the enemy was short enough for spotting officers to count turret faces and superstructure levels. Not just masts. On the gun decks, 5-inch crews ran through routines that had been drilled in safer seas. Ammunition parties hauled shells and powder cases. Loaders checked breech blocks and fuses. Trainers and pointers settled in behind their sights. They would not be firing armor-piercing shells at battleship belts. That was a losing contest. Their best chance was to go after superstructure radars, rangefinders, directors, bridges, if they couldn't sink the enemy fast. They could try to blind him and tear the fire control brain out of the big guns. The rest of Taffy, though, was moving too. On the CVEs, flight deck crews were already racing to spot aircraft and get them airborne with whatever ordnance they had. Pilots who had planned on a morning of close air support and anti-submarine patrols scrambled into cockpits loaded with depth charges. Small bombs, or even nothing at all, ordered to take off. Find the enemy, and attack however they could. A TBM Avenger carrying depth charges was not an ideal ship killer, but a screaming dive and a string of explosions near a battleship's bow could still force a captain to turn. Slow, or at least think the Americans had more tools in play than they really did. Evans' idea depended on exactly that kind of confusion. If the Japanese believed they were facing nothing more than a single escort group, the math favored them so heavily that all they had to do was keep coming. If, instead, they were made to believe they were charging into the teeth of a larger carrier force, one with destroyer screens willing to throw themselves into torpedo runs, and air groups launching constant attacks, then the picture on Kurita's bridge might look very different. To make that lie believable, someone had to act like the spearhead of a major task force. Evans decided Johnston would be that spearhead. He did not ask his crew whether they agreed. The men at the guns and in the engine rooms understood their captain well enough by October 1944 to know what his intentions were from the way the decks vibrated and the courses changed. As Johnston broke from the relative shelter of Taffy 3's smoke and pointed her bow straight at the oncoming line of battleships and cruisers, the ship's company shifted from drills and routines into the reality they had been preparing for since commissioning. In the pilot house, Evans focused on the closing range numbers and the shape of the enemy formation. Behind him, somewhere in the squalls and smoke, 6 escort carriers and the rest of Taffy 3 were counting on one thin destroyer to hit hard enough and close enough to change the way 23 enemy warships saw the battle in front of them. The crazy part was not that he meant to attack. It was that he meant to attack as if Johnston were not a tin can at all, but the first hard punch from a much larger hand. The first enemy salvos came in before most of Taffy 3's sailors had even finished processing what they were looking at on the horizon. Great white columns of water leapt up out of the sea, hung for a moment like ghost towers, then collapsed in sheets that drummed against decks and superstructures. The Japanese gunners were still finding the range, walking their fire in. Each new brace of splashes bracketed the escort carriers more tightly. Out ahead of them now, Johnston was no longer a smudge inside the smokescreen. Her bow had punched through into clearer water, presenting a small, hard-running target to gun directors that had been trained to pick up cruisers and carriers, not a destroyer darting at flank speed. Ranges dropped quickly. 15,000 yards, 14, 13, at each report from CIC. Evans and his gunnery officers recalculated. Torpedoes were their one weapon that could put a real hole in a battleship. But not from this far out. The ship needed to get inside 10,000 yards closer, if possible to give the fish a decent chance at reaching something important before they ran out of run or were avoided. That meant another few minutes of charging straight at the largest concentration of naval gunfire any of them had ever seen. At around 13,000 yards, Evans gave the order for Johnston's 5-inch guns to open fire. They were not going to wait until they were inside torpedo range to start fighting. The forward mounts elevated and trained, their barrels swinging across a slice of grey sea until fire control picked out what they believed to be a leading heavy cruiser, one of the ships on the flank of the battleship line. The first salvo cracked out. 5 sharp reports in quick sequence, the shells arced high, their flight invisible to the men on deck but tracked by spotters. A few seconds later, small splashes appeared short and off to one side of the target. Corrections went back into the sights, bearing a few degrees left, elevation up. The next salvo landed straddling, some splashes beyond the cruiser, some short, on the third. They began to find the ship itself. Against a heavy cruiser's armor belt, a 5-inch high explosive shell was a nuisance. Against upper works bridge, rangefinders, radars, gun directors, it was lethal enough. Reports later indicated that Johnston's early fire raked superstructure, starting fires and knocking out at least one director. To the Americans on her decks, the exact details were less important than the simple fact that they were hitting something. As the range fell into 10,000 yards and then below, the enemy's shooting improved as well. Splashes began to appear closer to Johnston herself, not just around the carriers behind her. One near miss slammed into the sea close aboard, sending a column of water high enough to drench the forward gun crews and rattle teeth. Shrapnel from another burst whipped across the destroyer's decks, pinging off metal, shredding light gear, and punching into anything soft. The ship's doctor and corpsman started their own battle aft, working over the first wounded as word passed that there would be more. In CIC, the torpedo solution was converging. One of the leading Japanese cruisers, believed to be Kumano, was turning slightly to bring more guns to bear. That turn, that change in course and speed, created the kind of geometry torpedo officers lived for. If Johnston could close the range just a little more and turn her own bow to present the right angle, she could send a full salvo of 10 fish across the cruiser's projected track. Evans accepted the extra seconds under fire that would cost. He held course and speed, letting the range slip down to around 10,000 yards, then swung the ship to bring both port and starboard tubes into viable firing arcs. To Japanese observers, it might have looked like the destroyer was simply jinking under fire. To the men on Johnston, the turn had a very specific purpose line up the shot that could take the nose off a cruiser or worse. The torpedo crews had been waiting for this. As the firing angle steadied, mount captains checked their sights one last time, waited for the bearing they had been given, and then pulled their triggers in sequence. Tube doors banged. Compressed air roared, and heavy shapes surged forward and out into the green water, each leaving a white feather trail behind it as its engine engaged. 10 torpedoes fanned out across the sea, invisible beneath the surface, but very real in the minds of every man on that destroyer. They had just committed their most powerful punch. Now they had to stay alive long enough to see whether it landed. They did not have long to wait. Minutes later, observers reported a violent eruption under the bow of a leading cruiser. The front of the ship seemed to disappear in spray and smoke. When it cleared, the cruiser's bow was mangled, its forward turrets twisted and slack. The ship's speed fell away as damage control parties fought to keep her afloat. For Johnston, that was one small piece of good news in an ocean of bad. The enemy line adjusted. Other ships turned to avoid the area where torpedoes might still be running. Formation cohesion frayed as individual captains maneuvered to keep from sharing their consort's fate. Every change like that cost the Japanese speed and time, both of which Taffy 3 desperately needed. The cost to Johnston was coming due as well, as she completed her torpedo attack and continued to fire her 5-inch guns. The destroyer crossed into a zone where more and more enemy barrels could reach her. Heavy shell accounts differ as to whether from a battleship or a cruiser found its mark forward. The impact threw men off their feet, collapsed bulkheads, and shattered equipment. Another hit near the waterline opened the hull, letting the Pacific in where it was never meant to be. Speed dropped, not catastrophically at first, but enough for engineers to feel the difference in the deck plates. Reports filtered up, flooding forward, some loss of power to weapons and sensors, casualties mounting. Evans acknowledged each one, adjusted, and kept issuing orders. Damage control teams moved in, shoring bulkheads, rigging pumps, fighting to hold the ship together while she was still needed. Behind Johnston, the rest of Taffy 3 was now fully engaged in its own desperate part of the fight. Smoke screens thickened, CVEs turned and twisted as much as their slow hulls and limited rudder authority allowed. Aircraft clawed into the air in ones and twos, some armed with whatever bombs or depth charges happened to be nearest, others with nothing at all but machine guns and nerve. Pilots circled, climbed, then bored in on the oncoming enemy ships, instructed to attack anything with a rising sun painted on it, to Kurita and his flagship staff. The picture growing on their own plots did not look like a simple slaughter anymore. Torpedo wakes had been reported. A cruiser was damaged. The destroyers in front of them were not dodging and laying a thin defensive screen. They were charging and shooting as if they were the vanguard of a much larger force. Planes pestered them, constantly dives, strafing runs, splashes of bombs and depth charges near hulls, the physical damage often small, but the psychological effect very large. Phase 1 of Johnston's fight had done what Evans intended it had forced the enemy to react, to maneuver, to bleed time and attention. But the destroyer had paid for that disruption with steel and lives. She was no longer the clean, fast ship that had left the carriers minutes before. Her decks were scarred, her forward spaces flooded, and her crew was already fighting on two fronts, one against an entire fleet, and one against the sea trying to get in. The question now was not whether Johnston had made an impact. It was how long a damaged tin can could stay in the center of a gun battle built for battleships, and how much more punishment she could absorb while still throwing punches back. When Johnston steadied out after her torpedo run, she was no longer the same ship that had charged through Taffy 3's smoke minutes earlier. Forward compartments were flooding. Some guns were out or degraded. Men who had started the morning at their stations were now in aid posts or lying still under blankets. But the enemy line was also no longer the same. A cruiser was mauled. The neat geometry of Kurita's formation had been bent and smeared by evasive maneuvers and the need to sort out damage. Evans could have taken that moment to slip back fully into the cover of smoke and rain, using what speed he had left to hug the carriers, throw up flak, and hope someone else stepped into the lead. Instead, as Johnston turned away from her torpedo run, he brought her back toward the main axis of the Japanese advance, putting his damaged destroyer between the enemy and the escort carriers behind him. He was not alone out there anymore. Howell and Herman had also charged, each captain independently coming to a similar conclusion about the value of a torpedo run and aggressive gunfire. But Johnston was the one that had already drawn serious punishment, and she remained one of the closest ships to the Japanese line. Her 5-inch guns kept firing, even with some directors damaged or out. Local control and manual training could still put shells into the air. The target list shifted from heavy cruisers to anything that was closing in on the CVEs, an advancing destroyer here. A cruiser turning in too sharply there. Each hit on enemy topside gear forced some officer on a Japanese bridge to deal with fires, casualties, or failing rangefinders instead of calmly walking salvos onto the retreating carriers. The favor was returned with interest. More heavy shells came in, some missing narrowly, others merging with Johnston's thin hull in concussions that felt like train wrecks. One hit knocked out the forward engine room, dropping the destroyer's speed and leaving her trailing a little more wake than she could afford. Another tore up the bridge, killing or wounding several key men and forcing Evans to shift his command position aft. From there, wounded and bleeding, he kept conning the ship. Orders were relayed by voice, messenger, and whatever phones still worked. There was no pretense now that Johnston was simply executing a clean piece of doctrine. She was surviving minute to minute, trading pieces of herself to buy time and disruption. Out to the east, the carriers were making the most of every minute bought. Aircraft swarmed overhead, attacking in whatever ad hoc patterns their fuel. Ordnance, and radios allowed. Avengers that had already dropped their bombs or depth charges made dry runs, screaming down toward battleships and cruisers to force them into turns and radical maneuvers. Wildcats stitched decks and bridges with machine gun fire. Anything to keep anti-aircraft gunners' heads down and add to the confusion. To the men on Johnston, the sight of American planes diving through flak to strike at ships 20 times their size was a reminder that they were not alone in this fight. To the Japanese trying to read the battle, the constant presence of aircraft felt like the calling card of a much larger carrier force. At some point in that chaos, Johnston became engaged in a close-range fight with enemy destroyers and cruisers pressing in. Accounts differ on the exact sequence. Battle reports were written later by shocked, exhausted survivors, but the pattern is clear. Whenever a Japanese ship edged in toward the vulnerable carriers, Johnston threw herself across its path if she could still make the angle. Her guns barked as fast as crews could feed them, chewing at upper works and gun mounts. The destroyer paid with more steel and blood each time. One enemy salvo wrecked most of the remaining topside control. Another punched into the after-engine room. Power failed in sections, came back partially, failed again as damage control parties struggled to route cables and feed pumps from whatever generators were still working. The list increased. Steering grew sluggish, yet the ship kept fighting. Damaged guns kept serving. Men kept carrying ammunition through smoke and twisted metal. At some point, Evans gave what amounted to his last general order about the ship's role. According to later testimony, he told his crew to give them everything you've got and made it clear that Johnston would not pull out so long as she could influence the battle. To some ears, that sounded like a death sentence. To others, it was simply confirmation of the promise he had made at commissioning. This was a fighting ship, and they were in harm's way. The cumulative impact of that kind of resistance was greater than the tonnage on any one hit. On Kurita's flagship, staff officers tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed they were attacking. They had been told they might run into American carriers, but the sheer ferocity of the destroyer and air attacks, the presence of torpedoes, the constant harassment from above and ahead, it all suggested to some that they were charging into the screen of a major task force, not a single escort group. Their own damage reports fed that impression. Hits taken, maneuvers forced, a cruiser with her bow blown apart, guns out of action. The time spent dealing with those problems was time not spent driving straight and fast toward MacArthur's transports. For Taffy 3, the immediate result was life measured in more minutes. Some CVEs took hits, some were mortally wounded, others dodged shells by what looked to survivors like inches. But none of them were instantly erased in the kind of clean, distant hammering the math on paper had promised. They twisted, turned, and ran, protected by smoke, squalls, and a handful of destroyers and DEs that refused to die quietly. Eventually, even a ship as tough in spirit as Johnston reached the end of what her hull and crew could absorb. Flooding became uncontrollable in multiple compartments, with power failing and steering compromised. She could no longer maneuver meaningfully, only wallow along at a fraction of her old speed. Guns fell silent one by one as power and ammunition ran out, or crews were killed at their mounts. Evans ordered abandon ship when it was clear that staying aboard meant only sinking with her. Men scrambled for rafts and debris under continuing fire. Some recalled him still at or near his station, guiding the evacuation, refusing assistance for himself. He was last seen near the fantail, without a life jacket, moving as if he intended to keep directing his men until the sea took the deck out from under him. He did not appear on any of the rafts after Johnston went under. The destroyer rolled and sank sometime late in the morning, leaving behind a patch of oil, debris, and men in life jackets spread across the waves. For those in the water, the battle did not end. They watched other ships continue the fight, heard the distant rumble of guns, and waited for rescue that would not come for hours. Some were strafed by passing aircraft that could not tell friend from foe in the chaos. Others simply drifted, thinking about the orders they had heard that morning and the way their captain had executed them. Up to the north and west, the Japanese center force wrestled with a different kind of exhaustion. Damage had been inflicted, ships had been hit, some severely, torpedoes had been reported. Air attacks continued to arrive in waves, often uncoordinated, but relentless. Reports from lookouts and signalmen painted a picture of determined resistance. From ships that, on paper, should have folded at some point after midday. Kurita made the decision that would define the Battle off Samar. He turned his force away. Instead of driving all the way in to scour the anchorage and support groups off Leyte, he reversed course and headed back into the waters he had come from. Scholars would argue for decades about his reasons conflicting reports: fear of air attack, concern about fuel and losses already taken. But for the men of Taffy 3 floating in the water or limping east on damaged decks, the effect was simple. The fleet that should have crushed them had turned away. Johnston lay on the bottom. Many of her crew would never see home, but the thin grey hull that Evans had promised to take into harm's way had done exactly what he said it would. It had fought until it could not fight anymore, and in doing so had helped turn a one-sided equation into something the enemy no longer wanted to solve. In the official histories, the Battle off Samar is one chapter inside the larger story of Leyte Gulf. On the chart, it looks almost abstract: lines of ships, arrows of advance, symbols for vessels sunk and damaged. What those lines don't show is that, for a few hours on the morning of October 25th, 1944, a single tin can destroyer helped convince a Japanese admiral that he was punching into something far more dangerous than 6 escort carriers and 3 thin-skinned destroyers. For his actions that day, Ernest E. Evans was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation talks about conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, about closing to point-blank range with heavy ships and continuing to fight after his own ship was shattered. The language is formal. The reality underneath it is simple. A captain who had promised his crew that Johnston would be a fighting ship kept that promise to the last possible moment. Strategically, Kurita's decision to turn away meant that the worst-case scenario off Leyte never happened. His battleships and cruisers did not roll down on the invasion anchorage, did not gun convoys apart at close range, did not turn MacArthur's return into a bloodbath on the beaches. Historians can argue how much of that was fuel calculations, how much was concern about air power, how much was confusion. But when they draw up the factors that pushed him toward breaking off, the resistance of Taffy 3 and the way those tin cans attacked always appears on the list. There are at least 3 hard lessons in what Johnston did that morning. Aggression can rewrite the math. On paper, 23 warships should have swept 1 destroyer aside without slowing. In practice, closing the distance and striking first forced the enemy to spend time and attention surviving instead of killing. Perception is a weapon, by fighting like the screen of a major carrier force. Taffy 3 made Kurita question what he was really up against, and leadership sets the emotional tone. Evans didn't ask his men to believe in a speech. He showed them what he thought their ship was for, and the crew rose or fell with that standard. If stories like this one matter to you, stories where small ships and ordinary crews stand in front of impossible numbers, go ahead and hit like. And subscribe to WW2 Echo Stories so more people can find them. Before you head out, leave a trace of yourself under this video. Let us know where you're watching from, whether it's a Navy town in the States or far from the Pacific. If there's a sailor, Coast Guardsman, or merchant mariner in your family, you're welcome to name them there too, and say how Evan's choice looks to you now a last resort, a calculated gamble, or exactly what you expect from a fighting captain. Every comment is a reminder that men like the crew of Johnston are still being remembered by real people, in real places, long after their ship slipped under the waves.